Chapter 1. A lavender-scented invitation. It was a damp but promising morning in St. Mary Mead, and the early mist had just begun to lift from the church spire when Miss Marple opened the Morning Post. She sat by the parlour window, knitting needles poised in mid-air, a bowl of pale blue wool resting gently on her lap. The scent of toasted bread and orange marmalade drifted in from the kitchen, where her housekeeper Gladys was fussing over a temperamental kettle. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite their delicacy, scanned the elegant handwriting on the envelope. Lady Horatia Gaul, it read, in a bold, flourished script she hadn't seen in over a decade. "My word," she murmured softly, carefully slipping a finger under the seal. The letter inside was written with the same practiced hand. "Dearest Jane, it has been far too long. Lavender Hollow misses you, or at least I do. You must come. I've opened my estate to a small gathering of artists, writers, and eccentric types, as you might expect. But something is troubling me. Odd glances, silences at supper, whispers in corridors, nothing overt, and yet I feel watched. Do come for a week. Your presence would steady me. Yours in friendship and suspicion, Horatia." Miss Marple placed the letter beside her teacup, lips pursed in thought. There was always a particular tone to Horatia Gaul's notes, faintly theatrical, unmistakably shrewd. They had once worked together on a wartime committee for recreational activities for evacuees, which largely involved keeping children from throwing stones through the vicar's greenhouse. But this invitation was different. The phrasing "watched" lingered with her. "Gladys," she called gently, "would you be so kind as to iron my lavender scarf later? It seems I might be traveling." By Thursday, Miss Marple found herself in the back seat of a powder-blue Morris Minor, driven by a cheerful young man from the local garage. Lavender Hollow sat on the edge of the village of Lower Marchford, a larger, more socially fluid place than St. Mary Mead, boasting both an artisan bakery and a yoga instructor. The estate itself was tucked between sloping fields and vast lavender meadows that shimmered under the pale spring sun. Lady Horatia, statuesque and silver-haired, met her on the stone steps with a theatrical sweep of her arm. She wore a silk kimono patterned with gold cranes and clutched a wide-brimmed hat that seemed as if it might take flight. "Jane, my dear," she exclaimed, "you haven't changed at all." Miss Marple smiled primly. "Well, one does hope not entirely. You, however, have become even more decorative." Horatia laughed, leading her indoors. "Come and meet the household. I do adore assembling strange mixtures. They react like drops of ink in a teacup." The drawing-room was modestly grand, full of mismatched velvet chairs and half-finished canvases. An easel stood by the French windows on which a wild, abstract piece was drying. Standing before it, brush in hand, was a tall young woman with a striking profile, narrow nose, soft jaw, and dark auburn hair pinned carelessly atop her head. "This is Camille Vance," Horatia said with pride, an absolute marvel with watercolors and wit. Camille turned and offered Miss Marple a warm, if slightly hesitant smile. Her eyes were large and intelligent, framed by lashes that seemed almost too perfect to be real. "A pleasure," she said softly. Her voice was feminine and elegant, but there was a trace of something beneath it, a firmness, as if she were choosing each syllable with care. "Likewise," Miss Marple replied, instantly alert to the subtle social currents around her. She noticed how Horatia lingered protectively near Camille, while across the room a portly man with a glass of sherry frowned into his drink. "That," Horatia murmured, as if reading her mind, "is Mr. Digby. Retired theatre critic, sharp tongue, dull morals." Another guest entered. Julian Gaul, Horatia's nephew, dressed in a green jumper with patched elbows and an expression of restless irritation. He barely nodded at Miss Marple, then glanced briefly at Camille, before walking to the bookshelf and pretending to inspect a row of old Penguin paperbacks. "Julian's a bit brittle," Horatia said diplomatically. "He doesn't adjust well to new ideas or people." Miss Marple said nothing. She merely noted how Camille's posture stiffened at Julian's arrival, her gaze dropping to the paint-smeared floorboards. The rest of the afternoon passed in slow introductions. Miss Marple met a soft-spoken sculptor named Maeve, a nervous poet called Timothy, and a newly arrived solicitor named Mr. Edwin Blatch, who declined tea and asked instead for a small bourbon, if it's not inconvenient. At supper, the conversation flowed easily, almost too easily, Miss Marple thought. There were comments on modern art, abstract truth, and the nature of gender in literature. Camille offered an insightful opinion about the picture of Dorian Gray, which made Mr. Digby snort rather rudely. "You can't rewrite Wilde through a modern lens," he said, swirling his port. "Dorian didn't suffer because of his beauty. He suffered because he had no soul." Camille responded coolly. "Or perhaps he suffered because society told him beauty was all he had." Julian looked up from his soup. "That's very easy to say, if you've had the benefit of reinvention." The word hung heavily in the air. Camille blinked once, then excused herself politely. Horatia's expression hardened. Miss Marple, who had observed the entire exchange without blinking, quietly reached for her glass of water. That night, in her guest room overlooking the lavender fields, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, gently folding the corner of Horatia's letter. A quiet house, well-educated guests, no overt hostilities. Yet something deeply unsettled. It wasn't Camille who felt out of place, Miss Marple thought. It was the others, who didn't know where to put her. She glanced at the window where moonlight turned the lavender fields silver. "People often mistake politeness for kindness," she whispered aloud. "But malice wears gloves in places like this." Then she folded her scarf neatly over the back of the chair, turned off the lamp, and drifted into the sort of light, dreamless sleep that comes before trouble begins. Chapter 2. Whisperings and Warnings. The next morning broke with an almost theatrical stillness. Sunlight spilled through the high windows of Lavender Hollow, painting honey-colored patterns across the parquet floor. Birds chirped in the orchard, but inside, the house had the peculiar hush of something waiting to happen. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and took her tea in the sunroom, where she could observe the estate's gentle rhythm. Camille passed through the garden below, her sketchbook pressed to her chest, eyes fixed ahead, as if the dew-covered path belonged only to her. Miss Marple noted the way Camille walked, shoulders drawn back, chin slightly lifted, not with arrogance, but defense. It was a stance she had seen before in young women who had learned to protect themselves through poise. Horatia joined her soon after, draped in a mauve shawl and holding two mismatched teacups. "I do hope Camille's not taking things too much to heart," Horatia murmured as she poured. "Julian can be unintentionally sharp." Miss Marple stirred her tea without replying immediately. Then, "One rarely draws blood without a purposeful blade, Horatia. And Julian seems rather fond of sharpening his." Horatia sighed. "He was always difficult, too clever for his own good. After his brother's death, he became harder still." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "I hadn't known Julian had a brother." "Charles died abroad. A scandal of some kind in Paris, though we were never given the full details." Horatia sipped thoughtfully. "Julian doesn't like to talk about it. I believe it had to do with money, or shame, possibly both." At breakfast, the guests gathered without ceremony. Camille was already seated, quietly buttering toast, her face unreadable. Julian appeared moments later, a copy of the Times under his arm, and took a seat at the opposite end of the table. The air between them crackled, silent but tense. No one mentioned the exchange from the previous night. Later that morning, Horatia organized a casual, creative hour in the music room. Camille was invited to recite a piece from her forthcoming performance, a monologue she had written herself, entitled Glass Becoming Mirror. Camille stood at the piano, the lace curtain behind her catching the spring breeze. Her voice, soft at first, gradually swelled with quiet authority. They told me I was mistaken, that the reflection I chased didn't belong to me. But what if truth isn't found in the glass, but in the hands that dare to break it? Silence followed her final line, a silence thick with something unspoken. Timothy, the poet, clapped first, nervously. Maeve joined in, then Horatia. Mr. Digby didn't move. Julian tapped his fingers on his knee, as if waiting for a sound that hadn't arrived. Miss Marple observed not the clapping, but the expressions. Julian's jaw tightened, Mr. Digby's lips thinned. And most curiously, Mr. Blatch, the solicitor, leaned forward, not as though inspired, but intrigued. The clapping faded. Camille offered a small bow and left the room quietly. That evening, just as dusk folded over the fields, Miss Marple stepped into the corridor outside her room and paused. A muffled voice was echoing from down the hall, near Camille's quarters. "I'm telling you this because I know how it ends," someone hissed. "Leave before someone else decides for you." The door creaked. Miss Marple waited a full minute before proceeding. She walked with quiet steps, glancing towards Camille's room, but found the corridor empty. The door was closed, the faint smell of lavender soap drifting from inside. She knocked gently. Camille answered, her face pale but composed. "Oh, Miss Marple." "I was just on my way to fetch a book," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Are you quite all right, dear?" Camille hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I'm fine, just tired. The reading, it stirred more than I expected." "Art often does," Miss Marple replied kindly. "But it's not always art that unsettles us, is it?" There was a long pause. "No," Camille said at last, "it's not." The next morning, a commotion stirred the household. "Her mirror's been smashed," Maeve whispered to Miss Marple as they stood by the garden door. "The small oval one, the one she always travels with." Miss Marple frowned. "That sort of thing doesn't break on its own." Julian appeared moments later, his voice unusually bright. "Accidents happen. Maybe it fell off the sill. People shouldn't be so dramatic." But people were being dramatic, not openly, but in the quiet, habitual ways that fill a house with suspicion. A teaspoon left slightly out of place, a side glance at breakfast, an unusually long silence over pudding. By midday, another development had taken root. A note slipped under Camille's door. She discovered it while collecting a cardigan. It read, in sharp black ink, "You'll never be her." No signature, no envelope. Just a single sentence, written on thick stationery from the house library. Horatia, reading the note in the drawing room, turned uncharacteristically pale. "I thought this sort of cruelty belonged to another century," she whispered, then turned to Julian. "Do you know anything about this?" He shrugged. "I wouldn't know where to find the library stationery. I prefer truth, not theater." Camille said nothing. She folded the note carefully, pressed it into the pages of her sketchbook, and went to sit alone in the garden. Miss Marple, however, walked to the library. She noticed that one of the notepads was missing its top sheet, and on the ink blotter faint impressions could be seen, backward and slightly smudged. She placed a thin sheet of paper atop it and gently ran a pencil over the indentations. The words came into view. "You'll never be her." She smiled faintly. "Heavy-handed," she murmured. She returned to her room and made a quiet note in her diary. Not the work of someone spontaneous. Someone waited to write it here. Someone cautious, or someone familiar with legal pads. That evening, the weather turned. A breeze swept through the lavender fields, rustling the stalks like whispered warnings. At dinner, Camille wore a pale blue shawl and spoke little. Julian, for once, didn't provoke her. Mr. Digby complained about the wine. Mr. Blatch declined dessert. Miss Marple excused herself early. In her room she stood at the window again, gazing at the swaying lavender and the pale moon above. Trouble, she had always believed, doesn't shout. It mutters. It creeps. It waits for polite conversation to finish. She closed her window, drew the curtains, and turned down her bed. But as she extinguished her lamp, she could not help but feel that something, or someone, had already crossed a line. Chapter 3. The Disappearing Brooch. The following day dawned bright but brittle. The air was crisp with the promise of spring, yet something sharp seemed to linger beneath the surface of Lavender Hollow, like a smile hiding a bruise. Miss Marple took her breakfast alone, declining the group meal with the excuse of needing to attend to correspondence. In truth, she preferred the quiet, a space to think, observe, and reflect. Outside, Camille stood in the orchard, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She was not sketching this morning. Instead, she stared into the trees with a distracted intensity, as if trying to decipher a private language spoken only by birds and branches. At 10 o'clock, Lady Horatia hosted a light tea in the drawing-room. The atmosphere, though civil, had cooled. Camille attended, reserved but polite. Julian arrived late, with his collar turned up and a vague excuse about overhearing poetry in the greenhouse that delayed him. Miss Marple sat quietly with a biscuit and noticed that Mr. Blatch, the solicitor, was inspecting the paintings on the wall with unnecessary interest. Mr. Digby commented on the vulgar modernism of one watercolor and returned to his drink. It was during this gathering that Horatia decided, on a nostalgic whim, to show her guests a family heirloom, a garnet brooch she claimed had once belonged to Queen Charlotte's lady-in-waiting. She disappeared into her private study and returned moments later with a small velvet box. Inside lay the brooch, an elaborate oval set in gold filigree, with dark red stones that glittered like dried blood under the chandelier light. Camille, seated near the fire, looked at it with evident admiration. "It's extraordinary," she said softly. "The garnets look almost alive." Mr. Digby snorted. "They do say bloodstones appeal to those drawn to drama." Camille did not respond, but Miss Marple noticed the way her fingers curled slightly around the edge of her armrest, almost imperceptibly. Horatia closed the box and tucked it under her arm. "Well," she said brightly, "back to its resting place before anyone starts plotting murder." It was meant as a joke, but the laughter that followed was forced and thin. The brooch vanished that evening. Horatia discovered its absence just before supper. Her study had not been locked. Never needed to be, she insisted. But the velvet box was gone from the glass cabinet where she always kept it. "I can't quite believe it," she murmured, pale with shock, as she stood in the center of the room. "I thought I was among friends." Julian was the first to speak. "I warned you about keeping valuable things about. People wander in and out of rooms at all hours." Camille looked up sharply. "Is that meant to imply something?" "Only that the doors aren't locked," Julian said with a shrug. "We're all strangers after all." Horatia raised a hand. No accusations, please. Not yet. Mr. Digby, seated by the window, added, I suggest a thorough search, starting naturally with the rooms of anyone who admired the brooch a little too loudly. The implication was clear. Camille flushed, but her voice remained steady. You can search my room if you wish. I don't think, Horatia began. It's fine, Camille interrupted. I'd rather put an end to this. Miss Marple, who had entered a few moments earlier, now spoke for the first time. Perhaps it would be more helpful, she said gently, to consider motive and opportunity rather than leap to conclusions. Though, of course, she added, many a criminal has benefited from a crowd that panics before it ponders. The search was discreet but thorough. Camille's room was neat, her suitcase half-packed in the corner, as if she had once considered leaving. Her wardrobe was undisturbed, her vanity simple and elegant. Nothing appeared out of place, until Maeve, the sculptor, opened the lower drawer of the side table and gasped. There, tucked beneath a folded jumper, was the velvet box. Gasps echoed. Horatia stepped forward, hand trembling, as she lifted the box. She opened it. The brooch was inside. Camille stared at it, unmoving. I didn't put it there, she said flatly. Someone did this deliberately. Julian folded his arms. And who exactly would do that? I don't know, Camille replied, her eyes wide but dry. But I didn't steal it. Horatia looked stricken. Camille, I don't want to believe. You don't have to believe anything yet, Miss Marple interjected. Let's all take a moment to breathe. That evening, the guests scattered across the house, each carrying a silent weight. Camille retreated to the studio. Julian went for a walk, alone, he insisted. Mr. Digby remained by the fire, swirling his port as if hoping for answers in the glass. Miss Marple went to the drawing room, where Elsie the maid was dusting the piano. Busy night, Miss Marple observed lightly. Elsie smiled thinly. It's always the quiet houses where the worst things happen. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed. Tell me, Elsie, who had access to the study this afternoon? Elsie hesitated, then said carefully, Everyone does, more or less. It's never locked, but Mr. Julian went in around 4. I saw him carry something small, like a book or a case. He said he was fetching notes. And Mr. Bletch. He was in there too, said he was checking on some documents Horatia left him to read. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And Camille. She's not once gone near that room, not while I've been about. Miss Marple smiled warmly. Thank you, dear, that's most helpful. That night, as the wind picked up over the lavender fields, Miss Marple jotted 3 names in her notebook. Julian, Bletch, Digby. Beside them, a single question mark for Camille. She underlined one phrase beneath them all. Motives, dress in finer clothes than suspects. But she added another note in softer ink, brandy glass, chalk smudge, altered taste, because something else had occurred at the tea gathering, subtle but certain. Camille had sipped her brandy and made a small face, as if something had tasted off. None of the others had noticed, except Miss Marple, and perhaps, she thought, whoever had tampered with it. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Studio. The weather turned the following morning. Grey clouds clustered low over the hills, and a persistent drizzle pattered against the greenhouse roof. Inside, the studio smelled of linseed oil and damp wool. Canvases leaned against the walls in quiet protest, that paint not yet dry, their stories unfinished. Miss Marple stood just inside the doorway taking in the disarray. The studio, usually open to all guests at Lavender Hollow, had become a quiet refuge for those too bruised by last night's accusations. Camille had not joined the group for breakfast, nor had Julian. Only the sculptor, Maeve, sat cross-legged by the window, chiseling away at a block of soft clay with slow, deliberate strokes. She looked up briefly as Miss Marple entered. "No word from Camille?" Miss Marple asked gently. Maeve shook her head. "She's avoiding everyone. I would too in her shoes." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, though sometimes the best way to clear one's name is to stop running and start watching." She wandered over to a stack of sketchbooks and flipped carefully through the top one. Watercolors mostly, dreamlike landscapes with improbable colors and gently blurred lines. There was beauty in them, yes, but also something uncertain. As though Camille had painted places she didn't trust or couldn't fully recall. Miss Marple moved toward the old desk at the back of the studio. It had once been a potting bench and still bore the scent of earth and chalk. The drawers were stiff but opened with effort. Most were filled with charcoals, broken pencils, and curled shavings, but the lowest drawer stuck. Miss Marple tugged again, and it gave with a reluctant groan. Inside, under a mess of thumbtacks and string, was a folded sheet of parchment, torn at the edges, yellowed with age. She unfolded it. A letter, part of one. The paper was thick, almost luxurious, and bore the imprint of a Parisian stationery company. "He can't undo what was done in Paris, not with money, not with silence. The truth will follow me, but perhaps if I disappear, it will follow someone else instead." "PCV?" Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. She read it twice more, then folded it again, and tucked it into her handbag. "Was this Camille's?" Maeve asked, rising quietly from the window. "I believe so," Miss Marple said. "Or at least, it belonged to someone she knew very well. The household was unusually quiet that afternoon." Julian had taken to pacing the conservatory with a furrowed brow, barking at anyone who disturbed him. Mr. Digby had confined himself to his room, claiming indigestion. Mr. Blatch was seen loitering by the library door, looking for all the world like a man with something to hide. And Camille remained out of sight. Miss Marple took tea alone in the parlor. Horatia joined her halfway through, bringing a plate of almond biscuits and an air of quiet frustration. "I do hope this nonsense resolves itself soon." Horatia sighed. "I opened Lavender Hollow for rest and inspiration, not whispering and melodrama." "I wonder," Miss Marple replied lightly, "if perhaps you've done both." Horatia gave her an arch look. "Tell me, Horatia," Miss Marple continued, "did your nephew ever visit Paris before Charles died?" Horatia's face stilled. "Yes," she said finally. "They went together, just after Julian's studies. I remember it because Charles never came back the same. Neither of them did." "Did Charles have companions, someone he was close to?" Horatia shifted. "There were rumors of a girl, or possibly a boy. No one knew for certain. Charles was the sort who spoke little and hinted much." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And Camille, was she ever in Paris?" "I believe so. She mentioned it once. Studied performance art there, I think." "Perhaps not just performance," Miss Marple murmured. That evening, in an effort to lift the house's mood, Horatia insisted on a card game in the library. Camaraderie through competition, she called it. The idea was met with reluctant enthusiasm. Camille, surprisingly, attended, quiet, pale, but composed. Miss Marple watched her closely. There was something different about her now, not broken, but contained, like a kettle just before it whistles. The game was a simple one, whist, but the tension beneath the surface turned every trick into a test of loyalty. Julian, seated opposite Camille, dealt cards with mechanical precision, barely looking up. Camille won the first hand with an effortless flourish. "Well played," Miss Marple said. Camille glanced up, and her lips curled faintly. "Thank you," My father taught me. He always said luck came second to patience. Mr. Digby, who had passed twice in a row, scoffed. Quite the performance, as always. Camille put down her hand. Do you mean my card game or my life? Silence. Horatia stood. I think that's enough cards for one night. Camille rose too, but her movements were slow, controlled, as if holding back words she might never be able to unsay. She left the room, her steps silent on the rug. Later that night, Miss Marple walked quietly to the studio once more. Something about the letter still gnawed at her. The signature, C. Verziers, could have belonged to Camille, yes, but the handwriting was older, firmer, more angular, not Camille's. She inspected the painting Camille had been working on the previous week. A Parisian street blurred by rain, its shadows full of suggestion. In one window a figure stood backlit, indistinct, neither male nor female, but both somehow. A signature in the corner. C. Vance 2012. Miss Marple frowned. Camille had only recently begun using her chosen name. Horatia had mentioned it. But this painting was dated years earlier, which meant either the signature was forged, or Camille had been Camille, in some form, far longer than anyone had realized. And if that was true, then someone here already knew. As she turned to leave, Miss Marple heard movement behind her. She turned. A figure stood in the doorway, broad-shouldered, motionless. It was Julian. "You're in quite the habit of prowling," he said, his tone low and oddly calm. Miss Marple didn't flinch. "And you're in the habit of watching who's doing the prowling." He stepped forward slowly. "That girl, she's not what she seems." Miss Marple gave a soft chuckle. "Most people aren't, but the difference is she's not pretending to be anything else." Julian's eyes darkened. "She'll ruin everything. My mother's reputation, this house, and what happened in Paris?" Miss Marple interrupted softly. He stiffened. Miss Marple tilted her head. "It wasn't Camille who made that choice, was it?" He didn't answer, just turned and walked away into the night. Miss Marple returned to her room, thoughtful. She now had a letter, a name, and a signature. But she lacked the one thing she needed most, the truth. And she suspected, with quiet certainty, that someone would do anything to keep it buried, even if it meant silencing Camille. Chapter 5. A Sudden Fall. The rain returned the next morning, soft at first, then steadier, drumming gently against the window panes like an old worry resurfacing. Lavender Hollow looked dimmer under the grey light, its normally bright garden muted and dripping. The guests kept to themselves. Miss Marple sat by the fire with her embroidery, but her mind was not on the stitchwork. She had slept lightly and poorly. The weight of questions unanswered about Camille's past, Julian's secrets, and the letter from Paris pressed against her with increasing urgency. Shortly after 11, a loud crash echoed through the house. Then a shout, brief, hoarse, and cut short. Miss Marple rose at once and made her way to the staircase, where Horatia was already rushing down the hall in a silk robe, panic in her eyes. Julian lay at the base of the grand staircase, half-sprawled on the marble tiles. One leg bent at a strange angle. A trickle of blood ran from his temple. Elsie the maid appeared next, gasping audibly. Camille came running moments later, barefoot, her hair damp from the garden. "What happened?" she asked, her voice breathless. I don't know," Horatia stammered. "I heard a crash. He must have fallen." Miss Marple stepped forward carefully and looked at the banister above. It was wet. A faint smudge of mud near the top step glistened in the light. Camille knelt beside Julian, her fingers trembling slightly as she checked his pulse. "He's alive," she whispered, "but unconscious." Mr. Blatch arrived with Mr. Digby just behind him. "Good Lord," the solicitor muttered. "Call an ambulance." Elsie hurried off. Horatia knelt beside her nephew, clutching his hand with trembling fingers. Miss Marple, however, turned back to the top of the stairs. 2 sets of footprints were faintly visible in the carpet's damp nap, one larger leading down. The other, lighter, paused at the top landing. She turned to Camille. "You said you were outside." Camille nodded, confused. "Yes, I was in the garden. I came in when I heard the noise." "Was anyone with you?" "No, I'd just gone for air. I didn't want to be inside." Julian stirred faintly, groaning. His lips moved. Horatia leaned down, listening intently. "He said—" He was pushed. The words dropped like stones into the silence. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. The doctor arrived within the hour. Julian had a fractured ankle and a mild concussion, but would recover. He was moved to the downstairs guest room, heavily sedated and sullen. By late afternoon, the mood in the house had soured completely. No one said it aloud, but the implication hung thick in the air. Camille. Once again, the finger of suspicion turned. At tea time, Mr. Digby asked loudly whether the police had been notified. Horatia said no firmly. "There's no evidence of a crime," she insisted. "We mustn't jump to conclusions." "No," Digby sneered, "just a string of unfortunate events that all seem to orbit one person." Camille, seated beside Maeve, didn't respond. She stared into her teacup, visibly shaken. Miss Marple watched the scene with quiet clarity. This was no longer social awkwardness, it was a campaign, not of truth, but of fear. That evening, while the others dined in stiff silence, Miss Marple excused herself and returned to the scene of the fall. The staircase was dry now, but the faint smear of mud remained at the top step. She took out a handkerchief and gently dabbed at it. Lavender soil. A pale, unusual hue, distinctive to the flower beds on the west side of the garden. She made her way outside. In the lavender plot, the rain had softened the soil, revealing disturbed footprints. Someone had walked through here recently. Near the path's edge, a torn fragment of cloth clung to a low hedge, pale silk, lilac in color. She pocketed it and turned, just in time to see Elsie watching her from the back steps. "Good evening, Elsie," Miss Marple said cheerfully. Elsie gave a polite nod. "Out for a walk, Mum?" "In this weather, I must be mad." She stepped forward. "Tell me, dear, do you know who's been washing their clothes in the utility room?" Elsie frowned. "Only me and Mr. Julian. He brought in a bundle this morning. Said he spilt tea on a jumper." "Ah, and what color was the jumper?" "Light purple, I think, or gray. Hard to say, it was soaked." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Thank you, Elsie, that's most helpful." The next twist arrived the following morning. The garnet brooch previously discovered in Camille's room was gone again, or rather, it was found again in Elsie's apron pocket. The house erupted. Horatia stared at her maid in disbelief. "Elsie, why would you do this?" "I didn't," Elsie cried, eyes wide with panic. "I've never touched that thing, I swear on my life." "She's lying," Digby said flatly. "She's been protective of Camille from the start." Mr. Blatch muttered something about class loyalty. Camille stood up. "She didn't do it. Someone's trying to frame her." "Oh, and who would do that?" Mr. Blatch demanded. "Whoever planted it in my room," Camille replied firmly. "The same person who pushed Julian, the same person who left that note." Miss Marple raised a hand. "I believe," she said gently, "that all these actions point to one thing. Not panic, but planning." The others turned to her. "You see," she continued, "someone here is trying very hard to discredit those they fear, and they've become increasingly clumsy. The note, the brooch, the torn fabric. And now, this business with the staircase. It all fits a pattern." Horatia looked pained. Jane, are you suggesting one of my guests is orchestrating this? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said softly, that someone here is afraid of being exposed, and that fear is making them dangerous. That night, Camille approached Miss Marple in the parlor. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. "You hardly know me." Miss Marple looked up from her book. "Idea," she said, "I've spent a lifetime learning what it means to be seen and not believed. And I've learned to tell the difference between someone who hides from malice and someone who hides from truth." Camille's eyes shone. "Then, do you believe me?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I do. But then why does it feel like no one else does?" Miss Marple set her book aside. "Because you remind them of what they don't understand, and people will fear what they cannot explain until someone forces them to confront it." Camille nodded, holding back emotion. "What do we do?" "We watch, we wait, and when the moment comes, we reveal." Chapter 6. A Name Not Spoken. The clouds broke the next morning, but the atmosphere in Lavender Hollow remained tightly wound, like a string drawn taut. The sun poured in through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the drawing-room air, light falling on troubled faces, unspoken thoughts, and a tension no amount of tea could dissolve. Julian remained confined to the guest room, surly and silent. His injuries were real, but his silence had become more strategic than sullen. Horatia visited him twice but emerged each time visibly shaken. Miss Marple, watching from the corridor, noted that the third visitor was Mr. Blatch. Camille, though outwardly composed, had begun to unravel beneath the strain. Her eyes had deepened with fatigue. She no longer sketched, no longer spoke much unless directly addressed. Even Maeve, usually so gentle, had grown withdrawn, as though waiting for something to explode. Miss Marple, however, remained unusually busy. While others fretted, she moved quietly about the house, into the library, the conservatory, the linen cupboard, and finally to the attic. There she found a box marked "Ghoul. Personal, Charles." It was wedged behind an old tapestry and covered in dust. She lifted it carefully and brought it to her room. Inside, the contents were modest: a French theatre program dated 2012, a narrow gold tie, and several letters tied with blue ribbon. One envelope, however, caught her eye. It bore the faint stamp of a Parisian hotel, and inside, a photograph: two young people laughing on the banks of the Seine. One was unmistakably Charles Gall, tall, fair-haired and elegant. The other, dark-haired, sharp-cheekboned and striking, stood close to him, half leaning on his shoulder. The second figure wore an open-necked shirt, their expression full of mischief. Androgynous, confident. The initials CV was scrawled on the back, in Charles's hand. Miss Marple stared at the photo for a long time. Then she closed the lid. Later that day, Miss Marple joined Horatia in the parlor, where the elder woman was arranging tulips with a distracted hand. "You've been troubled," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. Horatia sighed, pressing a flower too firmly into the vase. "This house is turning into a stage production, Jane. Accusations, accidents. Now Elsie's fled, I couldn't stop her." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Then she said gently, "Tell me what happened to Charles." Horatia froze. "Why now?" she whispered. "Because the past is no longer buried. It's speaking through your nephew. And Camille." Horatia set the flowers down and sat heavily in the armchair. "Charles went to Paris when he was 22. Julian was with him. They were both reckless in those days, too clever for their own good and full of ideas." Miss Marple nodded. "And?" "There was a relationship, Charles became deeply involved with someone he met in the theater scene. It ended badly. There were arguments, money missing, threats of scandal. He came back, broken, and within 6 months, he was gone. Gone where? Horatia looked down. He took his own life, but we didn't tell Julian the truth. He thought Charles died in an accident. It was easier. But Julian knows now. Miss Marple said, I believe Camille was part of that chapter in Paris. Horatia looked up sharply. Number. That's not possible. That person, Cam, was a boy. She was a person, Miss Marple corrected gently. One who has lived a full life since. But what matters is this. Julian recognized her, and he's been afraid ever since. Horatia looked as if she might cry. I can't believe Julian would harm her. Perhaps not intentionally, but when people protect their secrets too long, they begin to poison everything they touch. Horatia stared at the fire. And what now? Miss Marple stood. Now, we look where no one has yet dared to. That evening, as the household settled uneasily into supper, Miss Marple entered the studio again, alone. She stood before Camille's Parisian painting, now dry, the rain-streaked windows of that distant memory perfectly preserved. In one corner, a silhouette stood, neither clear nor hidden. A figure suspended in a state of becoming. She traced the signature again. C. Vance 2012. Behind the canvas taped gently to the frame, she found a folded note. On it, in Camille's handwriting, he said I would always be a secret, but I was never ashamed. Not then, not now. Later, Miss Marple found Camille by the window in the music room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. You were in Paris in 2012, Miss Marple said quietly. Camille didn't turn. Yes. You knew Charles Gaulle? Yes. Were you lovers? Camille exhaled. Briefly. We met through the theater. He was kind, curious, but he was afraid too. Afraid of being seen with me. Afraid of what it might mean. Julian hated me. Miss Marple nodded. And when Charles died, I left. I never spoke of it again. Until now. Miss Marple sat beside her. He loved you. That's clear, and his brother resented it. Camille closed her eyes. Julian blamed me. He said I humiliated Charles, that I poisoned his mind. He sent me messages for years. Then silence. Until this. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and handed her the photograph. Camille's hands trembled as she took it. I didn't know this still existed, she whispered. That night, Charles told me he'd keep it forever. Miss Marple laid a hand gently over hers. He did. Outside, the lavender fields stirred in the breeze, dusk falling like a hush over the garden. In the guest room, Julian stared at the ceiling, his face a mask of stillness. On the chair beside him lay a pale purple jumper, freshly washed, faintly scented with lavender. And in the shadows of the hallway, Miss Marple made a decision. The truth was no longer waiting to be discovered. It was ready to be exposed. Chapter 7. Camille vanishes. The night Camille vanished, the house was cloaked in stillness so profound it felt unnatural. Not the peace of rest, but the hush that follows a withheld breath, an entire house waiting to exhale. Miss Marple awoke just after 3. Not from a noise, but from its absence. She sat up slowly, then crossed to the window. Outside, the lavender fields rippled beneath the moonlight. Something felt unsettled. By morning, her instincts were confirmed. Camille's bed had not been slept in. Her suitcase, half-packed the previous night, was gone. Her watercolor set had been cleared from the studio. Even the letter tucked into her sketchbook had vanished. The house stirred with confusion, then concern, then a fear that settled like fog over the breakfast table. She's left, Mr. Digby said flatly. Fled. Probably realized her time was up. That's absurd, Maeve snapped. She wouldn't just run. She would if she was guilty. Horatia held a hand to her temple. Enough, please. Miss Marple said nothing. She watched each face in turn. Julian was present but silent, seated stiffly in his wheelchair, the bruise on his temple faded but still visible. I saw her last night, Maeve said suddenly, by the garden gate. She said she couldn't sleep. I told her to rest. She said she'd come in soon. Horatia frowned. That gate leads toward the woods. Miss Marple stood. Then I believe it's time we walked that way. The search party was small. Horatia, Maeve, Mr. Blatch, and Miss Marple herself. They moved slowly through the wet grass, eyes scanning the undergrowth. By the pond, just beyond the tree line, Horatia stopped abruptly. Over there, a single pale shoe, Camille's, rested near the water's edge, slightly sunk into the mud. Nearby, a silk scarf was snagged on a bramble. Miss Marple knelt. No sign of a struggle, but she was here. Mr. Blatch narrowed his eyes. She could have thrown herself in. Maeve paled. She wouldn't. Miss Marple stood. Let's not speculate. Let's find out. Horatia sent for the gardener and the local constable. The pond, shallow but clouded, was soon dredged. Nobody. Nothing but murky water, a silver ring, and a muddy pocket mirror that didn't belong to Camille. The search continued through the day, but yielded no sign of her. By evening, the whispers had started again. Julian claimed not to remember anything. She probably ran. Can you blame her? Everyone hated her. That's not true, Maeve snapped. You did. You hated her because she reminded you of your brother. Julian's eyes flared. You don't know anything? Oh, but I do, Miss Marple said gently, stepping into the room. He turned to her. This is all theatre to you, isn't it? No, Miss Marple replied. This is grief and guilt wrapped in fear. She handed Julian a sheet of paper. It was the photograph, the one of Charles and Camille. Julian looked at it, and for the first time, something in him cracked. She destroyed him, he whispered. He gave up everything for her, his name, his money, his future. And she left him. Disappeared. Miss Marple watched him. No, she said quietly. She was the only one who stayed. It was you who made him believe he had to choose. Julian looked up, stunned. You pushed him to deny her, and when he couldn't, you watched him collapse under the weight of shame you created. And now she's back. And you were afraid she'd reveal what really happened in Paris. Julian said nothing, but his hand trembled. Horatia entered then, her face pale. We found something. Back at the house on the far side of the garden, where the soil had been newly turned for spring planting, the constable had uncovered a patch of earth that hadn't quite settled. Just beneath the surface, wrapped in canvas, lay a satchel. Inside, Camille's documents, clothes, and a page torn from a diary. He followed me into the garden. Said I couldn't ruin them. That Charles didn't love me. That I was a ghost he'd buried long ago. Horatia read it aloud, hands shaking. Miss Marple, gently, took the note. It's not a confession, she said. It's a warning. She knew someone wanted her gone. Then came the final twist. At dusk, the telephone rang in Horatia's study. Miss Marple answered. A faint, crackling line. This is Camille Vance. I'm safe. Horatia, overhearing, nearly collapsed. Where are you? Miss Marple asked calmly. A hostel near the coast. I walked through the woods. I had to disappear just long enough to make them panic. I couldn't stay. Not until I knew. Knew what? That someone would believe me. Miss Marple smiled. We do, and it's time to return. The next morning, Camille walked through the front gate of Lavender Hollow. Dressed in the same pale blue coat she had arrived in, she looked thinner, paler, but no less composed. Horatia embraced her with silent tears. Maeve held her hand tightly. Mr. Digby left the house by noon. Julian remained locked in his room. Miss Marple returned to her writing desk where she wrote a single line in her diary. The mirror did not shatter. It simply reflected what they chose not to see. Chapter 8. The Girl Who Was There. It was a mild afternoon, the lavender fields at last beginning to bloom again beneath the spring sun. A hush had settled over Lavender Hollow, not the taut silence of secrets, but the peace that follows them being spoken aloud. In the drawing-room, Lady Horatia had gathered the household at Miss Marple's request. The windows were open, the curtains drifting gently in the breeze. Camille sat at Horatia's side, her posture upright, but calm. Maeve was nearby, watchful. Mr. Blatch stood stiffly near the fireplace, arms crossed. Julian, still seated in his wheelchair, looked pale, but composed. He had insisted on joining despite his injury. Miss Marple sat with her hands folded neatly on her lap. "I thought it time," she began, "to clarify what has occurred here. Because although it may seem to some that Camille's presence brought disruption, what truly stirred this house was not her, but the past." She paused, letting her words settle. Years ago, Charles Gould traveled to Paris. There he met someone who saw him for who he was, not what he was expected to be. Camille, then known by another name, was that person. They shared something real, something dangerous. Dangerous not because it was wrong, but because others believed it to be. Julian stared ahead, unmoving. When Charles returned home, he brought with him not shame, but possibility. Yet he was met with silence, denial, and fear. He was told that his feelings were unnatural, that his choices were a disgrace. That message came most forcefully from his own brother. Julian shifted but said nothing. The result was predictable. Charles, caught between honesty and familial rejection, broke under the weight of secrecy. He took his own life, and for years that truth was buried. Miss Marple turned her gaze on Julian. "But you, Mr. Gould, knew. You recognized Camille the moment you saw her here. And you feared she would expose what really happened in Paris, that Charles had loved her, and that your cruelty had driven him to despair." Julian's voice came at last, soft and sharp. "She killed him." "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "You did. Not with your hands, but with your silence, with your hatred. Camille didn't return for revenge. She returned for closure." "She lied about who she was?" "She never lied," Miss Marple said calmly. "She changed. She became herself. That isn't deceit. That's survival." There was a long pause. Miss Marple continued, her tone firm now. "Faced with that fear, you chose to destroy her reputation. You planted the brooch in her drawer. You tampered with her drink. You slipped that cruel note beneath her door. And when it wasn't enough, when she still held her head high, you staged your own fall down the staircase and tried to shift the suspicion to her again." Gasps rippled through the room. Horatia's hand flew to her mouth. "Julian," Miss Marple turned to her. "You didn't know, none of us did, but the signs were there." She reached into her bag and retrieved the torn letter, the silk scrap, and the photograph. "These are the fragments of a truth someone desperately tried to erase, but the past does not remain buried no matter how deep one digs." Camille spoke softly now for the first time in days. "I didn't want to bring pain. I wanted to honor him. Charles was the only person who saw me, fully, without judgment. I came back to say goodbye, to finish the painting he asked me to start. Miss Marple looked at her gently. You did more than finish the painting. You restored what had been taken. Julian's face was unreadable, but for the first time he looked not angry, but hollow, empty of the defense he'd worn like armor. Mr. Blatch cleared his throat uncomfortably. Will this go to the police? Horatia answered firmly. I think the truth has gone far enough. Julian will leave Lavender Hollow. Today, the inheritance will be reviewed, and Camille will remain, should she wish. Camille said nothing. She merely bowed her head. Acceptance, not submission. Later that evening, Miss Marple wandered into the studio one last time. The Paris painting was complete now, its silhouette in the rain fully realized. It was no longer a blur. The figure stood proudly now, visible, grounded, real. Camille entered behind her. Is it finished? Miss Marple asked. Camille smiled faintly. Not quite, but I think the hardest part is. Miss Marple looked at her, eyes warm. You're braver than most. I never wanted to be, Camille said, but sometimes life demands it. They stood together for a moment in the lavender dusk. Then Miss Marple said half to herself, You know, in gardens, the strongest flowers are often the ones that were once pulled up and replanted. They bloom not because the soil is kind, but because they insisted on growing anyway. Camille looked at her, eyes glistening. I'll remember that. Miss Marple departed the next morning, her bag packed neatly, her hat straight, and her knitting folded beside her. Horatia hugged her tightly. You've done more than solve a mystery, Jane. You've given this house a chance to breathe again. Miss Marple smiled. All I did was listen. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think.